One of the hardest truths about abusive relationships is that they rarely begin with fear. Most of the time, they begin with attention, with someone making you feel noticed when you've spent most of your life feeling invisible. They begin with compliments, affection, gifts, and promises. They begin with someone saying all the things your insecure mind has been desperate to hear. People often look at abusive relationships from the outside and ask, why didn't they leave? But what they usually don't understand is that by the time someone realizes they are trapped, the emotional foundation underneath them has already been slowly dismantled. Confidence disappears quietly. Independence fades slowly. Isolation happens piece by piece. Eventually, survival replaces identity. This series is different from most episodes of Under the Surface. Bonnie's story is being told in her own words. Some moments are difficult, because the realities of abuse are difficult to hear. There are no dramatic reenactments here, no sensationalism, just the truth about what survival sometimes looks like behind closed doors. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this episode contains discussions of domestic violence, sexual assault, emotional abuse, addiction, and trauma. Some moments may be difficult for survivors to hear. Please take care of yourself while listening. Pause or step away if needed. And if you are someone who has lived through something similar, know that you are not alone. This is Bonnie's story. Welcome to No One Is Normal, the podcast where real stories remind us that none of us are alone. You can also visit the website www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co for resources, updates, and future podcast episodes. I am Brad H. Hill, and each week we talk about the messy, the complicated, and the deeply human moments that shape us and remain in our memories. I am not here to tell anyone how to live. I am here to offer the stories, the insights that made me realize that no one is normal, including me, because healing starts when self-honesty begins. Bonnie's story didn't begin with violence. It began long before that. It began in instability, fear, survival, and watching the people around her suffer in silence. As a child, she grew up around abuse, addiction, and chaos. Her father struggled with alcoholism and drugs. Violence inside the home was normalized before she was old enough to fully understand what she was witnessing. She remembers hearing her mother cry behind closed doors, while her father heard her. She remembers trying to intervene as she got older, only to be shoved aside. Even as a little girl, she saw what fear looked like inside a relationship. And her mother had already survived more trauma than most people could imagine. At only 8 years old, Bonnie's mother lost her father after her mother's boyfriend hid in a closet and murdered him while he slept. She ended up in foster care afterward, and eventually suffered abuse there too. Later she met a charming man who promised her a better life. That man became Bonnie's father. Trauma has a way of repeating itself quietly across generations. Sometimes people spend their entire lives trying to outrun pain they inherited before they were even born. Bonnie describes growing up poor, moving constantly, and eventually becoming homeless with her family, while her father ran from the law. They lived in a car for nearly 2 years. Stability never really existed. Neither did safety. She spent most of her childhood feeling insecure, shy, and emotionally disconnected from the world around her. Imagine trying to figure out who you are as a child, while constantly feeling uprooted from everything around you. New schools, new places, no consistency, no real sense of home. Bonnie talks about never really having close friendships, because they were always moving. Just as connections would begin forming, they would disappear again. That kind of instability changes people emotionally. It teaches children not to feel secure anywhere for too long. It creates loneliness that follows people into adulthood. It also creates vulnerability, because when someone finally comes along and offers affection, consistency, or validation, it can feel overwhelming in the best and worst ways. And maybe one of the saddest parts of all of it is this: she still had dreams. She wanted to model someday. She wanted to feel beautiful, wanted, important, and loved. At 16 years old, she met a 23-year-old man who made her feel those things. That age gap matters. A 23-year-old does not emotionally relate to a 16-year-old as an equal. At 16, Bonnie was still trying to figure out who she was. She was insecure, emotionally vulnerable, inexperienced, and desperate for validation. He was already an adult man with life experience, confidence, and the ability to manipulate situations in ways she was too young to fully recognize. That is not a balanced power dynamic. That is grooming. And grooming rarely looks threatening in the beginning. At first, he seemed charming, persistent, protective. He brought her little gifts, complimented her constantly, told her how beautiful and how special she was. To a shy teenage girl who already felt emotionally starved, it felt meaningful, maybe even safe. Her mother warned her to stay away from him. She knew he was too old, knew something felt wrong. But manipulation rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as affection first. Bonnie tried resisting his advances initially. She only wanted friendship. But over time, his persistence wore down her boundaries. He convinced her that what he felt was love, and eventually she believed him. That's one of the things people misunderstand most about abusive relationships. They imagine victims walking directly into danger knowingly, but many times people are walking toward what they believe is love, safety, validation, or belonging, especially when they've spent their entire lives feeling emotionally unseen. Grooming often works by identifying emotional vulnerabilities and filling those spaces slowly. Compliments become emotional dependency. Attention becomes emotional control. The victim starts associating the manipulator with safety, validation, excitement, or love before the abuse ever becomes obvious. By the time the dangerous behavior begins, emotional attachment already exists. One thing society still struggles to fully understand is how grooming works psychologically. People often picture manipulation as something obvious and immediate, but many times it is subtle, patient, and emotionally strategic. Older manipulators often identify vulnerabilities first. They notice insecurity, loneliness, family instability, lack of confidence, emotional neglect. Then they position themselves as the person who understands the victim better than everyone else. That creates emotional dependency slowly. Bonnie describes feeling shy, insecure, and disconnected socially before she met him. She didn't feel attractive, confident, or important enough. Then suddenly, an older man starts telling her she is beautiful, mature, special, and desirable. To an emotionally vulnerable teenager, that attention can feel intoxicating, especially when someone has spent most of their life feeling invisible. And grooming often includes creating emotional separation from protective voices. Her mother warned her repeatedly, but over time his voice became much louder, emotionally, than her mother's warnings. That is part of manipulation too. The abuser slowly becomes the primary emotional influence in the victim's life. Once that happens, outside concerns start sounding like interference instead of protection. The relationship slowly became physical. At first it was innocent, holding hands, kissing, small moments that felt exciting and new to someone young and inexperienced. Bonnie writes about wanting to save herself for someone she truly loved someday. She still had innocence left in her life, still had dreams about relationships being safe and meaningful. Then one day, while she was babysitting, everything changed. She describes how he came over while the child was sleeping upstairs. They watched movies together in bed, kissed, cuddled. She felt nervous but still safe enough to trust him. Then he began pushing things further physically. She repeatedly said no, tried pushing him away. Then suddenly his hands wrapped around her throat, and in that moment, fear replaced trust completely. He raped her. One of the most heartbreaking realities about sexual violence inside manipulative relationships is how survivors often struggle to even label what happened to them initially, especially when the assault is committed by someone they trusted, dated, or believed loved them. People sometimes wrongly assume a rape only happens through violent attacks by strangers, but many survivors experience assault inside relationships where emotional manipulation already exists. That emotional attachment creates confusion afterward. Victims question themselves, minimize what happened, rationalize it, or convince themselves it wasn't really assault because the person was their boyfriend or partner. That confusion is exactly what manipulators rely on. And Bonnie's reaction afterward reflects something tragically common among survivors: silence. Not because she was weak, not because she accepted what happened, but because shame, fear, confusion, and emotional dependency had already begun shaping her reality. She writes about trying to believe him when he claimed he helped her overcome intimacy fears. That statement alone shows how deeply manipulation can distort someone's understanding of consent, trust, and love. Love does not require fear, force, or someone to surrender their boundaries to avoid violence. But when someone young is emotionally conditioned slowly enough, even obvious violations can become psychologically tangled beneath confusion and self-blame. And afterward, life did not suddenly stop. That may sound obvious, but trauma often works that way. Survivors still wake up the next morning, still go through routines, still try to function emotionally, while carrying something internally that they do not fully understand yet. Bonnie kept seeing him afterward, not because she wanted to be hurt, but because trauma and manipulation had already started reshaping her understanding of love and control. Eventually, he convinced her to start skipping school to spend time with him. Then drinking and partying became part of their relationship dynamic. Slowly, the future she once imagined for herself started slipping away. That's another thing abuse often steals from people: their trajectory. Dreams disappear quietly at first. Goals fade into survival. Education becomes less important than emotional chaos. Stability gets replaced by crisis management. And little by little, the person someone once wanted to become starts fading underneath survival behaviors. I think that part hit me especially hard because when people hear survivor stories, they often focus only on the moments of violence. But abuse also steals futures quietly. It steals confidence, opportunities, education, friendships, identity, and the ability to imagine a different life. Bonnie talks about wanting to model someday. That may sound small to some people listening, but dreams matter, especially to young people. Dreams are tied to identity. They represent possibility, direction, hope, and one of the saddest things about abusive dynamics is how survival slowly shrinks someone's world until dreams feel unrealistic or even selfish. Eventually, people stop asking, "What do I want out of life?" and start asking, "What will keep the peace today?" That emotional shift is devastating because it changes how people see themselves internally. Survivors often stop viewing themselves as individuals with goals and begin seeing themselves primarily through survival roles. Eventually, he convinced her to move in with him at 17 years old, despite her mother desperately trying to stop her. Her mother warned her repeatedly not to go, but by then he had already isolated her emotionally enough that she chose him anyway. And when she moved out, something happened that would emotionally trap her even further. Her mother, angry and heartbroken, told her not to come back. Looking back now, Bonnie understands those words came from fear and desperation. But at 17 years old, she took them literally. She believed she had nowhere else to go if things fell apart. That is one of the most devastating parts of abuse dynamics. Isolation doesn't always happen all at once. Sometimes people become emotionally stranded before they even realize they're trapped, and once someone believes they have nowhere safe to return to, leaving becomes psychologically harder long before physically. I also think many people underestimate how powerful emotional isolation becomes once someone feels cut off from support systems. Abusers often do not isolate victims immediately. It usually happens gradually. Arguments about friends, suspicion about family, jealousy disguised as protection, control disguised as love. And eventually the victim begins withdrawing voluntarily because maintaining outside relationships becomes emotionally exhausting. That is one of the cruelest psychological parts of abuse. People slowly disappear from their own lives. Friends stop hearing from them. Family contact becomes inconsistent. Hobbies disappear. Confidence fades. Personality changes. And because the changes happen slowly, survivors themselves often do not realize how much of themselves they have lost until years later. What hit me hardest listening to Bonnie's story wasn't just the violence. It was how early survival became normal for her. So much of her childhood taught her that instability was something people simply endured. Fear became familiar before safety ever really had a chance to. Sometimes people grow up around dysfunction for so long that disorder starts feeling emotionally normal. Not safe, not healthy, just familiar. And familiarity can be dangerous because people often mistake familiar feelings for trustworthy ones. If someone grows up watching control, fear, instability, or emotional unpredictability inside relationships, they may unconsciously tolerate behaviors later in life that healthier environments would immediately recognize as red flags. That does not mean survivors are responsible for what happened to them. It means early experiences shape what people normalize emotionally. Bonnie spent her childhood surrounded by instability. Abuse was not some distant concept she only saw in movies or heard about on the news. It existed inside her home. She saw her mother survive it. She heard the fights, heard the crying, saw fear firsthand. When children grow up inside those environments, survival instincts often develop before emotional security ever has a chance to. That kind of upbringing can leave people craving peace while simultaneously struggling to recognize what peace actually looks like. I think a lot of people underestimate how powerful emotional starvation can be. When someone grows up feeling insecure, unseen, unstable, or unloved, attention can feel like oxygen, especially at 16 years old, especially when someone older and more confident suddenly makes you feel important. And that's what makes manipulation so dangerous. It doesn't usually arrive looking evil. It arrives looking comforting. I also think people underestimate how strategic grooming can be. It is not always some dramatic, calculated plan. People can easily recognize from the outside. Sometimes it is gradual emotional conditioning, learning someone's insecurities, learning what they need emotionally, learning what makes them feel wanted, and then becoming the source of those feelings. That creates dependency before control ever fully appears. The other thing that stayed with me was how quickly shame entered the story after the assault. Bonnie didn't tell people what happened because she felt embarrassed and afraid. That happens to so many survivors. They carry the shame for something that was done to them, while the person who hurt them convinces them it was love. People often imagine abusive relationships as constant violence, but many survivors describe something much more psychologically confusing. There are moments of affection mixed between moments of fear, kindness mixed with cruelty, apologies mixed with control. That emotional inconsistency creates confusion, powerful enough to trap people for years. And once isolation begins, it becomes even harder to recognize what's happening. The line that stayed with me most from this chapter is not actually spoken directly, but it hangs over the entire story. It never starts looking like a prison. It starts looking like someone who finally makes you feel wanted. Another thing that struck me deeply was how much Bonnie minimized her own instincts early on. She said no, multiple times. She felt uncomfortable. Her mother warned her. Part of her recognized danger. But manipulation teaches people to override their own instincts, especially when affection and fear start becoming emotionally tangled together. And once someone begins doubting themselves emotionally, they become easier to control. That is one of the cruelest parts of gaslighting. It does not just distort reality temporarily. It changes how people relate to themselves internally. They stop trusting their judgment, discomfort, fear, and boundaries, and eventually they stop trusting themselves altogether. Hearing Bonnie's story affected me deeply because of how many childhood similarities we shared. Different details, different experiences, but the same feeling of instability underneath it all. The same feeling of watching adults struggle while trying to figure out who you are at the same time. What hit me hardest was realizing how young she still was when all of this started. 17 years old is still a kid in so many ways. At that age, most people are trying to figure out friendships, school, dreams, and who they want to become. Meanwhile, she was already trying to survive manipulation, assault, emotional control, and fear. And I think what bothers me most is how invisible these situations often are from the outside. People see someone staying in a relationship and assume weakness, but they don't see the psychological conditioning happening underneath the surface. They don't see the isolation, the confusion, the shame, the gradual destruction of confidence. I kept thinking about how survival slowly becomes a habit before healing ever begins. That sentence stayed in my head while working through this chapter because it explains so much about trauma. Eventually, people stop thinking in terms of happiness and start thinking in terms of safety. They stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "Well, how do I avoid conflict today?" That changes people. Trauma also changes the nervous system in ways many people never fully understand unless they have lived through it. Survivors often become hyper aware of moods, tone shifts, footsteps, facial expressions, and emotional tension because their brain adapts towards survival. Eventually, peace itself can start feeling unfamiliar. Many survivors describe always waiting for the next argument, the next accusation, or the next explosion, even during calm moments. Their body never fully relaxes because unpredictability becomes psychologically exhausting, and over time, living in constant emotional survival mode reshapes self-worth too. People begin believing, "I am the problem. I deserve this. If I were better, this would stop. Or nobody else would want me anyway." That internal erosion is part of emotional abuse too. The bruises are not the only injuries. And maybe one of the most painful realities is that abusive relationships often create emotional contradictions survivors struggle with for years afterward. Bonnie talks about how he made her feel loved and special at times. That confuses people on the outside. They wonder how someone can love a person who hurts them. But human emotions are complicated, especially when abuse is mixed with affection, attention, apologies, promises, dependency, and fear. That emotional confusion is not weakness, it is trauma. And I think many survivors spend years blaming themselves for not recognizing manipulation sooner. But when someone slowly conditions your reality over time, it becomes difficult to identify where love ended and control began. I also kept thinking about the phrase, "Where are you going to go?" That line may be one of the most psychologically devastating weapons abusers use, because eventually people begin believing it. They believe nobody else will want them, nobody else will understand. They are too damaged, too isolated, too financially dependent, too emotionally broken, or too ashamed. And once someone loses hope in alternatives, survival becomes about endurance instead of escape. That is why judgment towards survivors is so dangerous. Shame already traps people emotionally. Judgment only reinforces the prison. And maybe one of the most powerful parts of Bonnie sharing this story now is that telling the truth breaks some of that silence. Abuse survives best in secrecy. Manipulation survives best when victims feel ashamed to speak. But there is something incredibly powerful about hearing someone finally say, "This happened to me," not dramatically, not for sympathy, just honestly. Not everyone listening to this episode has experienced domestic violence, but I think many people understand what it feels like to slowly lose pieces of themselves in unhealthy situations. Some people lose themselves in relationships, in addiction, trying to keep peace inside families, and trying to become whatever other people need them to be. And eventually they wake up one day, barely recognizing themselves anymore. One of the hardest parts about emotional manipulation is that it teaches people to distrust themselves, to second-guess instincts, to minimize pain, to explain away behavior that should never be normal. Sometimes survival looks like silence, shrinking yourself to avoid conflict, and walking on eggshells every single day. And sometimes people become so focused on surviving that they forget they deserve peace too. I also think there are listeners hearing this who may recognize parts of themselves in Bonnie's younger years. Maybe not in abuse itself, but in the insecurity, in the loneliness, in the desperate need to feel chosen or valued by somebody. That need is deeply human. Everyone wants connection, love, and to feel important to somebody. There is no shame in that. The tragedy is when manipulative people weaponize those emotional needs against vulnerable people. If parts of Bonnie's story connected with your own experiences, I hope you understand something important. What happened to you does not erase your value. Being manipulated does not make you weak. Being abused does not make you broken. Being vulnerable enough to trust someone does not make you stupid. It makes you human. And healing often begins the moment people stop blaming themselves for surviving the only way they knew how. One thing that Bonnie's story makes painfully clear is that abuse rarely destroys someone all at once. It happens gradually, piece by piece, boundary by boundary, fear by fear, excuse by excuse. That gradual erosion is why survivors often struggle explaining their stories to people who have never experienced manipulation before. Outsiders see isolated incidents. Survivors experience psychological conditioning happening over years. And maybe that is part of why telling the truth matters so much. Because stories like Bonnie's help people recognize patterns earlier. They help survivors feel less alone and understand abuse is not always loud in the beginning. Sometimes it sounds caring, sounds protective, sounds like love, until one day it doesn't anymore. What began as attention and affection slowly became control, fear, and isolation. And by the end of this chapter, Bonnie was already trapped emotionally, long before she fully understood how dangerous the situation had become. In part 2, the manipulation becomes more aggressive. The emotional control becomes physical. The gaslighting intensifies. And the version of Bonnie that once dreamed about becoming a model slowly starts disappearing beneath survival mode. This is Bonnie's story, and we're only at the beginning. Just a reminder, the stories and conversations in this podcast are for informational and personal reflection only. Nothing shared here should be taken as medical, legal, or professional advice. Always speak with a qualified professional about your own personal situation. Thank you for listening to No One Is Normal. If today's message resonated with you, you can find the book No One Is Normal on Amazon and Kindle, and explore more resources at www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co. Remember, you weren't meant to be normal, you were meant to be you.